Hello everyone, welcome to Bio 105 Exercise 10 Part 2. We're going to continue to talk about plant diversity, plant structures and their functions. We're going to be focusing on the angiosperms or flowering plants this time. So if you remember from our last tutorial, our fourth innovation was flowers, right? That gave rise to the angiosperms or flowering plants. They all belong to one phylum, Anthophyta, and they are a large, very successful group of plants. Angiosperms can be further divided up into two groups, monocots and eudicots. It used to be referred to as dicots. The monocots have one cotyledon, hence the name. Cotyledon is basically a storage area in the seed of the plant. And the eudicots, right, or formerly known as dicots, the di part means two. That means there are two cotyledons there. There's a number of other differences between them. Your monocots are going to have flower parts in threes or multiples of three. Oops. Eudicots, their flowers are in fours or multiples of 4 or 5. Monocots, the leaf venation is parallel. Eudicots, the leaf venation is in a net pattern. Vascular bundles in the monocots are spread throughout the stem. Vascular bundles in the eudicots are arranged in a ring, usually towards the outside of that stem. So classic examples of monocots are irises, corn, wheat, that sort of thing. Some eudicots are roses, violets, and sunflowers. The root systems are different. Your eudicots tend towards what is called a taproot. So you've got a main root with some large branches off of that, these lateral roots. Dicots usually have a fibrous root. So you've got multiple roots coming out with multiple branches coming off of those roots. So the stems, we talked about the vascular tissue, so xylem and phloem. In our monocots, the xylem and phloem are in these little bundles that are distributed throughout the stem. If you look at them under the microscope, some of these little bundles even look like a little screaming face emoji. In our eudicots, there are discrete bundles with xylem and phloem, and these are located along in a ring, right? And it tends to be along the outer sort of edge of the plant. You're not going to see vascular tissue in the middle. Right? So, unlike our gymnosperms, angiosperms have wide, flat leaves. Their main function is photosynthesis, and they can be used to identify plants down to the genus and species. So these plants are performing photosynthesis. Photosynthesis requires an input of carbon dioxide, and they're also going to release some oxygen as well. So there needs to be gas exchange between the leaf and the outside environment. If you look at a leaf in cross-section, it's mostly open space inside there with a water-resistant cuticle on the outside. The gases are able to exchange in and out through these openings called stomata. So what's happening here is these stomata can open and close. If conditions are good, they'll open, they'll allow gases to exchange, right? This is controlled by these guard cells, right? So here's an open one, here's one that is closed. So if things are too hot, too dry, these stomata will tend to close. The other thing that's happening through these stomata is something called transpiration. There is the evaporation of water, right, that is leaving the plant and going out into the atmosphere. That water leaving allows the vascular system to draw more water up from the rest of the plant and the roots. Now we get to what makes the angiosperms special, the flower. So the flower is a specialized shoot that has modified leaves. We often call them petals. Many flowering plants rely on insects, birds, other animals to transport their pollen. Right? There's still some air pollination that goes on among the angiosperms, but a lot of them use these secondary pollinators. The big thing that allows them to do is you can pollinate over long distances. So you don't need to be right next to each other so the wind can carry your pollen. You can be however far a bird can fly or however far a bee can fly away from each other and still exchange genetic material. And some of these flowers are very specialized for one type of pollinator. Here's a classic example of that. We've got Darwin's orchid. It was discovered by this guy named Louis Marie Aubert du Petit Thouars. It's a great name. When Charles Darwin saw this, he postulated, because he looked at this flower and realized this is what they call a nectary. So the only place where nectar is produced in this flower is down at the very end of this long tube. And so he said there must be a pollinator with a really long proboscis that can get down there and sip that nectar. The actual pollinator for this plant wasn't discovered in Madagascar until 21 years after Darwin died. But then they found it, and here's this moth, and you can see this ridiculously long proboscis that it has, these mouth parts many times the length of its body that it can use to get down in here to get that nectar. And when it does so, its head bumps up against the flower here and transfers pollen. So let's talk about the basic anatomy of one of those flowers. Starts with the sepal. These are basically modified leaves that support the rest of the flower. The petals, you can think of these also as modified leaves, but they are colored and shaped in such a way as to attract whatever the pollinators are going to be. The stamens made up of two parts, the anther and the filament. Right? So this is the male part of the plant. The filament holds up the anther, and the anther is where the pollen is going to be produced. So the female parts, they are referred to as a pistil or a carpel. And so that is made up of the style, that is just the stalk that holds up the end of it, and the end here is called the stigma. That stigma is generally sticky so that any pollen will stick to it, and then each of those pollen grains will actually send a little tube down and transfer their genetic material to the seed or the egg that's inside that ovule. These ovules, so each one, they're all contained inside the larger ovary, and the ovules each contain a potential future seed. Right? You can see if you cut laterally through the ovary, the different plants have different arrangements of these ovules, and the ovary can be divided up into different sections depending on the species. So fruits. So the seed is an embryo packaged along with a food supply, and then the fruit is that mature ovary that was surrounding the ovules and the seeds, and that is also sometimes surrounded by a fleshy floral tube as well. And what's happening here is you're basically wrapping up your seeds in a nice enticing package so that some animal will take that and disperse it for you. The seeds themselves, they are basically little baby. So we've got an embryo here, or a little baby plant with its boxed lunch here, which is the cotyledon. So we've got our embryo, its little root, and then its food here stored in the cotyledon. It's mostly starch, but also some proteins and other nutrients. So seed dispersal. So these seeds can be dispersed in a number of different ways. The reason this is important is that you don't want your seeds to be directly under the parent plant. They'll be competing with the parent plant, and they'll oftentimes be shaded by that parent plant. So the classic form of dispersal that you see all the time on the UNE campus are squirrels and acorns, right? So squirrels take a bunch of acorns, they bury them, they forget about some of them. Those acorns end up later growing into oak trees. Birds are another big distributor. They'll eat especially small fruits. They tend to eat the entire fruit, and the seeds will pass through their digestive system. Some other seeds will also stick to animals like burdock. Other seeds are wind distributed, either having airfoils like our maple seeds here, or having little tufts like this milkweed seed so they can travel on the wind. Some of them will also be explosively spread. Jewelweed is an example around here. When the seeds are ready and you touch the outside of the bud, they will explode open and they'll shoot those seeds quite a long distance. And then water distribution. Some of them are distributed by water. The classic example of that is when we're talking about coconuts. Right? Coconuts can survive in salt water for long periods. They get dropped into the ocean and they can go off and colonize these little coral atolls and islands in the Pacific. So just a real quick review. We started out with our ancestral green algae. All right, we had our non-vascular plants, then our vascular non-seed plants, our mosses, club mosses, and our pterophytes and ferns, and then our gymnosperms, and finally the angiosperms that we're talking about today. So to wrap up, all of our flowering plants are in the same phylum, Anthophyta. Right? It's one big phylum. Flowering plants are divided into monocots and eudicots. Monocots differ in their leaves, seeds, roots, and transport systems from eudicots. Flowers are specially adapted shoots with modified leaves that are specialized for reproduction. It's their one and only function. Flowering plants often co-evolve with a specialized pollinator, and we talked about a few examples of that. Flowering plants also have diverse strategies for dispersing their seeds. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you in lab.